Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for attending this English Australia webinar. I'm Sophie O'Keefe, and I'm the Professional Development Manager at English Australia. Tonight's webinar is the first in a two-part series about learning differences, and it focuses on identifying learning differences in English language teaching. The second session will be held on the 10th of March at the same time, and it will cover practical strategies for inclusion of learning differences in the classroom and how learning materials can be adapted. You can register for that session on the English Australia website. I'd now like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Varinder Unlu. Varinder is based in the UK, so it's quite early where she is today. And she's worked in ELT for 26 years across all contexts. She's currently an academic manager, teacher trainer, materials writer, conference speaker, and the coordinator of IATEFL's Inclusive Practices and Special Education Needs Special Interest Group. Thanks for joining us this evening.
I was going to say good morning. It's good evening to you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Hello. Thank you so much for inviting me to present this webinar. It's always good to connect up with people across the globe. Yeah, so I'll get started because we don't really have too much time and there's a lot to get through. So what I would like to do to start off with is get everybody involved from the beginning. So I wonder if you've all got a piece of paper and pen with you. Are you making notes by any chance? Because for this, you're going to be doing an activity in a second, and you will need a piece of paper and a pen to do this. So shall I give you a couple of minutes and to sort that out, and I will move on to the next slide. Okay, so let's have a look. Okay. So while you're doing that, I'm going to explain what the activity is, and it's going to be about how it makes you feel, okay, as a participant. So you're going to have 30 seconds to copy down some sentences. What I'd like you to do is, while you're copying down the sentences, think about how it feels, how it makes you feel. How many times do you look up at the screen? And what strategies are you using to complete the task? Okay, so 3 things you need to think about: how it makes you feel, how many times you look up at the screen, and what strategies you use to complete the task. Okay, so hopefully by now you've all got yourselves a bit of paper and pen. Okay, now using your usual hand, and this is the hand that you normally write with, so your people often say the stronger hand, you're going to be writing this, as I said, 30 seconds to write a sentence. Okay. Okay, stop. Okay, think about how that made you feel. Think about how many times you looked at the screen. Think about the strategies you used to complete that task there. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next thing. Again, you're going to be writing another sentence, and again, you're going to get 30 seconds to do this as well. Here we go. This time you're going to use your other hand, so the hand that you don't usually write with. Okay, so if you're right-handed, use your left hand. If you're left-handed, use your right hand. And here we go, 30 seconds starting now. Okay, stop. Okay, still thinking about how you're feeling, how you're completing the task, how many times you're looking up at the screen to do this. Okay, and still using your weaker hand, still using the hand that you do not normally use for writing. I'd like you to write this sentence, and again the same thing with 30 seconds. Okay, stop there. Okay, you'd be glad to know that you can go back to using your stronger hand again. So whichever hand you normally write with, and the final sentence for you to write down is this one. Again, keep thinking about the strategies you are using to complete this. Here we go. Okay, stop there. Right, okay, let's see if we can get some comments perhaps in the chat box or in our Q&A box even, about how people felt about that, and whether you managed to complete it in the 30 seconds. Is there anyone who would like to add any comments about what they felt? Okay, so we've got some saying they didn't complete it, frustrating with the weaker hand, only the first part, it was impossible to finish, managed much better with his good hand, lots of pressure made it harder. Yeah. Yeah. Of course, it was challenging with the weaker hand. Yeah, not able to complete the last sentence. Yeah. Some of you gave up. Okay. Yeah. It's hard, isn't it? It's a difficult task. It is a very difficult task. This is interesting. I can read and write Arabic so quick and easy, and the other language is struggling. Okay. Found it hard with the left hand and didn't finish the other languages. Yeah. Okay, so I mean, this task is just to put you into the shoes of our learners, really. You know, we do this all the time with our learners. We ask them to note things down, you know, sort of put things up on the board. And we think it's just a very simple task, and, you know, they should be able to do this. What's happening? So it is a difficult task to do, isn't it? Even in your L1. What kind of strategies did you develop to complete the task? Did you develop any strategies while you were doing that? So writing with the other hand, I was concentrating more on the physical aspects and not thinking about what I was writing. Yeah, a lot of people say that. So it just becomes something that you're just copying down. Weak hand was just horrible. I hated what I produced. Visualization. Yeah. Okay. Try to complete the sentences in chunks. So lots of different strategies coming up here. In the last group, I pretended it was just shapes. Interesting. Yeah. Okay. These are things that we can perhaps look at. Yeah, this is what happens. So you know, you do develop your own strategies when you come across something that's a little bit more difficult, perhaps, or, you know, unfamiliar, or, you know, you're struggling with. So we're going to be looking a little bit more at that a bit later. So let's look at what's involved. So what was it actually involved in just that simple task of writing a sentence down? All those 4 sentences that you wrote down, what was actually involved? What kind of things did we do? So I'll give you the first one. One is memory, isn't it? We use our memory. So we're looking at the sentence, remembering what's up on the screen or up on the board that's been written on the board, remembering it and putting it down on paper. Any other things that we use? Any other things that are involved in okay, first one's memory, fine motor skills, yep. Concentration, remembering how the word sounds, yep. Looking for patterns, using the meaning of the sentence. Wonderful. We're getting some of them. So we've got memory and concentration, organization and sequencing, obviously, to put the sentence in some kind of order here. Chunking, reinterpretation, orthography, yep. Reading aloud, then the word as I write, wonderful, okay. Phonological processing, this is the sort of sounding it out, isn't it? So you're looking at the word. What about the word in Arabic? Were you sounding that out? Patience. Yeah, it requires a lot of patience. Visual processing, coordination, and social skills. So we've got all of these things happening while we are writing down a simple sentence, what we say a simple sentence. So you're focusing on memory, concentration, organization and sequencing, phonological processing, visual processing, coordination, and social skills. With the social skills, going back to the sentence that was written in Arabic, which side of the page did you start? Did you start on the left or the right? Right, okay, well done. Those of you who started on the left, you know, we know that a lot of people started on the left. You're not alone. Many people do this. It's just normal. You know, we kind of just look at it and just do what we normally do as well. Yep, okay, brilliant. So social skills are part of what we do as well, you know, sort of knowing what we're writing and how it's written down. So when we think about, you know, as I said, doing something as simple as this, so many things are involved. So when we have a learner with a learning difference or a learning difficulty, things become a lot more complicated and things become a lot more difficult for them. So we're going to start today, in today's session, we are actually going to be looking at how we sort of try to identify learners who are having problems and how, you know, sort of how to pick those learners out. And then we've got a second session lined up in a couple of weeks time where we'll be looking at how to actually help those learners in class as well with more sort of practical ideas. So what are specific learning differences? Everyone knows about dyslexia. I suppose dyslexia is the sort of the most common, the sort of best known learning difference, and most people will either know somebody who has dyslexia or are dyslexic themselves, and it's the one that everybody just generally focuses on when we think about learning differences. There are obviously many others as well, but it's the one thing that most schools will focus on, not just in English language teaching, but also you know, in mainstream education. They put a lot of focus on dyslexia. So it's seen back in the day, people used to say it was a problem with reading and writing. But those of you who know a little bit about dyslexia, or know a lot about dyslexia, because everyone, you know, these days is aware, it's more about phonological processing. It's not so much the reading and writing. It's not being able to identify sounds and hear the sounds. And then, of course, that causes problems with reading and writing, because as you're writing, then you're you're not able to spell things properly or read the sounds properly as well. So it's actually to do with sound rather than just reading and writing. Learners with dyslexia often have problems with short-term memory, short-term working memory. So things don't actually retain things as well as someone who doesn't have dyslexia. And they have difficulty with organization and coordination. So that student perhaps in your class who has, you know, bits of paper everywhere, never knows where to sort of put things, or is always late to class, you know, they're sort of a bit disorganized, and are having, maybe is having problems with the learning side of things. You know, here it should perhaps, you could perhaps look at that in a little bit more detail, and perhaps think about how to work with that learner and find out if there's anything else going on apart from them just being disorganized. So dyslexia is one. Then we've got ADHD. ADHD some people believe it's not a real thing. There has been a lot of sort of criticism of it as well. And in the United States, for example, I saw a documentary last year where they were trying to cure people with ADHD in these camps. They had special camps for them, and they do some awful experiments on these kids. It's again a developmental difference, and it affects the part of the brain that controls attention, impulses, and concentration. So here with ADHD, it's not about a sort of a lack of attention. It's too much attention, you know, and the person with ADHD is unable to ignore what's going on around them. You know, they're focusing on everything and anything that happens around them. And so then it becomes a lack of focus for them. So again, you know, we get a lot of learners with ADHD in our classrooms too. And it's just how do we identify that they do have ADHD? That's the key here. So, oops, sorry, my slides seem to be. Dyspraxia is another one, and this one affects the sort of motor skills and coordination. It's people with dyspraxia generally tend to be very sort of sensitive to light and noise and sort of the environment around them. It does affect their spatial awareness. Again, you know, when you see sort of perhaps not so much younger children, but sort of older children and adults bumping into things, not being aware of what's around them, and sort of knocking things over, sometimes falling down, etc. You know, it could be a sign of dyspraxia. I say could be because we don't want to be labeling people too soon without them having being assessed properly by a professional. But these things that you need to be perhaps looking out for as a teacher in class, where, you know, perhaps if you do have a student who is struggling in class and you need to try and get them assessed. Other learning differences, we've got dyscalculia. Perhaps the sort of least researched out of all of them, perhaps. And people often don't know what dyscalculia is, and it is the difference with mathematics, numbers and shapes and things like that. And again, the problem here is with memory, and students who have or people who have dyscalculia often have problems with solving problems, difficulties having problem solving, sorry. And this can impact language learning as well. Again, you know, you've got the memory side of things and also problem solving difficulties. So someone with dyscalculia, just because it's a problem with numbers doesn't mean that it doesn't impact language learning. It does, because of the other things that manifest from it. Asperger's, although now it's no longer called Asperger's, actually it's been changed to autism. It is autism. They just put it under the same umbrella. And this is, again, not a problem. Here we don't have a problem with memory. Here we have too much memory. And again, it's something that people are often very familiar with, because you've probably, again, read about it or know someone with autism. And often, it's a problem with social interaction or changes in routine. People can't, people with autism, have difficulty managing any kind of change in routine, and really sort of narrow interests as well in different things. Now, all of these things that I've mentioned here, as you know, they all come on a spectrum. There's a very wide spectrum. So you could have learners on the most extreme side of this spectrum, or they're somewhere at the other end, or somewhere in the middle. So identifying learners with a learning difference can be quite difficult, because it could be that they're just having problems just because something else is going on in their lives, or they're just going through a bad patch or something. But if it's a continuous thing that you're sort of identifying in class, then it's worth looking into and trying to find out a little bit more from the learner, but also from other people in the organization, and the sort of, if it's a child, from the family as well. And we'll have a look at how we do that. So these, as I said, all on a spectrum, but at different levels on the spectrum. Other learning differences that we sometimes forget. So we have visually impaired learners who perhaps sometimes don't know they're visually impaired, but are having problems. Others may be aware of that. People with hearing problems or are deaf. Going back to visually impaired, it's again, it's such a wide spectrum for that as well. And the way visual impairment impacts learning. Gifted students. We often, again, don't think about gifted students as someone to be, as people to be included in this as well. Those students who sort of just always are ahead of everyone, often they get bullied by their peers, or they may even get ignored by the teacher because they're just getting on with things, really. And those with physical disabilities as well. So there's a lot of things that we, when we look at learning differences and inclusion, there's quite a lot for the teacher to think about. Here, this chart is, I put this in the slides because well, it makes sense to me, but I will sort of go through it with you as well. And you've got all the different learning differences here, and they are crossing over, as you can see, crossing over each other. And then in these bits here, you've got, sort of over and under sensitive to light, noise, touch, and temperature, speech and language difficulties. So dyspraxia and autism, Asperger's, etc. They overlap here. You've got dyslexia, where you've got difficulty with words, and ADHD, and then here you've got lack of concentration, distractibility, where they're overlapping, and then all of these here where you've got these things coming into it as well. So neurodiversity, where it's difficulty with organization, memory, concentration. So all of them have that issue there. Poor listening skills, things that then happen, things that then impact the learner from that are things like low self-esteem, anxiety, depression, if they're not supported and helped in class in the right way. So this kind of we'll come on to the next bit and I'll explain a little bit more about what it means. So going back to the overlap here, when you have a learner, when you have a person with one learning difference, research has shown that it coexists with something else. So dyslexia and ADHD often co-occur, not at the same level often, but you know, the person will have elements of dyslexia and ADHD together, perhaps other bits in there too. So it's not always just one thing. All of these learning differences, dyslexia, dyspraxia, ADHD, etc., autism, they're hereditary. So someone somewhere in the family already has the same thing as well. So, or, you know, are dyslexic or dyspraxic or have ADHD. And this is something that, again, we didn't know about very much about, but again, you know, research done into this shows that it does occur. So if you may have a father or a mother or grandparent or uncle or aunt, even, you know, more than that in the family, and it's just passed down through the family. And then one in eight people that we know about has a learning difference. Again, going back to that spectrum that we were talking about, you know, it does depend on where on the spectrum they are. It could be sort of very low down on the spectrum, or it could be at the extreme end. But 1 in 8 is quite a high number that we know about, the ones that we are identifying. So if we look at how many people are in today's meeting, webinar, we've got 62 people here. I think, you know, there's a good chance that some of us are dyslexic or dyspraxic, or, you know, have elements of ADHD, etc. here. And if you look at your classes, depending on how many students you have, so normally in my classes that I teach, we normally have around 15 to 16 students. I would probably have 1 or 2 students in there who do have a learning difference and need extra support, sometimes even more. It all depends on sort of, you know, the makeup of the group as well. But it's being aware of that, you know, sort of understanding that it's a very common thing. Now, with all of these things that we've looked at, they don't impact intelligence. So someone with dyslexia or ADHD or dyspraxia, it doesn't make them less intelligent than their peers. It doesn't make them sort of unable to learn in the right way. They can achieve whatever everyone else is achieving. The problem was, before we became aware of these learning differences, was that, you know, we would ignore those students in the classroom. We would just sort of, either they'd be sitting at the back in the corner, or we'd just think they were just being difficult, and they just would be ignored by the teacher, because the teacher obviously wasn't aware and didn't know how to deal with it. Now that we do have a lot of research done in this area, and we are much more aware of learning differences, we are able to now support our learners in the right way to ensure that they can achieve what they need to achieve, and you know, and they can do what everyone else is doing, without feeling different, I suppose, in class, and without feeling that they are unable to achieve and are not supported. So it's something to think about when you are in class with 15, 20, 30 students, whatever your context is, and thinking about, you know, who the learners are in that group, perhaps, who are showing signs that are slightly different to the other learners. So, but before I mean, again, as I said to you just a few minutes ago, you know, we try to avoid labeling people too quickly, because, you know, obviously it's that's not a very nice thing as well. And putting a label on someone as dyslexic or someone having ADHD can also be quite a demoralizing thing for the learner themselves as well, especially if they are an older learner, an adult. So the problems we face when we are trying to identify someone with a learning difference, first of all, cultural differences. Now, there are so many cultures where having a learning difference is actually a disability. Not so long ago here in the UK, it was seen as the same thing. You know, if you Google learning differences, you will still see a lot of websites saying disabilities rather than differences. And the reason why we've started labeling it as a difference is because it's about learning in a different way. It's not a disability, it's learning in a different way. So the brain is wired up slightly differently, and we need to be able to support that in our classrooms. So cultural differences, yes, going back to sort of the stigma attached in certain cultures about learning differences. It's just, you know, if you're teaching children and you approach a parent and say, you know, I think that perhaps you know, there's something else going on here and we need to identify that. A lot of time in some cultures, parents will be like, well, no, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with my child. And they, you know, they won't be happy to sort of, you know, explore that further. And that's a real shame, because if we can help, especially younger learners from an early stage, then it just helps them throughout their lives to become better learners. But it is perceptions of disability and difference that can be a problem. Again, not just with younger learners, but adults too. I've had lots and lots of experiences with adult learners, because that's what I do mainly, is teach adult learners, where it's clear that they have a learning difference, but when you actually approach them about it, they feel like you know, you're telling them that they're somehow broken or something is, you know, sort of really wrong with them. So understanding that is really important. So we as teachers, before we start sort of going in and saying, oh, you know, you might be dyslexic, or I think you have ADHD, we have to be quite sensitive to our learners' backgrounds and understanding how it might make them feel as well. Linguistic differences. I mean, here it's obviously looking at the learner's L1 and understanding how that's going to impact someone with, for example, dyslexia. Some languages, so for example, Italian learners don't get identified as dyslexic till much later, in fact, because the language, you know, it's very sort of phonetic, so you read it as it's written, and it's quite easy to sort of oversee. You know, you don't see the sort of the learning difference there. Whereas when they start learning English, that's when the learning difference shows up. It's quite interesting. So linguistic differences are really important to understand as well. So looking at the student's linguistic profile, where they come from, and how that learning difference is going to show up in English. So for example, if you've got a Chinese learner or an Arabic learner or an Indian learner of English, how is that going to show up? Because the script and the way they, you know, pronunciation and everything is so different to how we, you know, the English alphabet. So it's important to remember that as well. And again, very difficult to identify in Chinese learners, the Japanese learners, etc. I think, you know, it shows up in different ways with learners from those countries. So you've kind of seen a learner in your class who perhaps you're thinking, oh, okay, you know, we need to be perhaps looking a little bit further into this and trying to identify what's going on here. So how are you going to communicate it to that learner? You know, what are you going to actually say to the learners? You know, sort of, again, as I said, you know, we can't just kind of point at them and say, oh, I think, you know, you're dyslexic, or I think, you know, you need to get assessed for this, because it's quite a big thing. It's a big thing for the learner to be labelled in that way. So communication, you need to do it in a very sort of sensitive way. And here it would be gathering a lot of background information about the learner first. So working with the students who speak different languages and sort of understanding a little bit more about, especially again with adult learners, finding a little bit about their background, having a meeting with them, talking to them about how perhaps their learning experiences were before they started learning English when they were children, what life at school was like for them, what things they found easy, what things they found difficult at school. You know, things like this are really, really important to help you understand where this learner is coming from. Just personal examples from learners that I've supported in the past. So I had an Iranian man in one of my classes, and he was incredibly intelligent, you know, very intense, and wanted to do a degree at a British university and was trying to complete his IELTS exam, but he just couldn't pass the exam. He couldn't get the score that he needed to get into university, even though he was able to you know, sort of talk about things very fluently, was able to express ideas very well, just could not get the score that he needed. But he did have other behaviors. So he would always be late for class. He never really made any friends. He was very sort of antisocial, slightly what we might call slightly sort of odd, you know, quirky, and kept himself to himself a lot. So it was just having that first meeting with him and sitting him down and just finding out a little bit about how he was at school and when he was a young child, what things happened, etc., in his learning experiences. And he then, once I sat him down and spoke to him about these things, it became very apparent actually that there was something else that was affecting his learning, his ability to do things. We had 3 or 4 meetings like this where we just sat and spoke about learning and how, you know, what makes a good learner, etc. And I got a little bit of background on how he felt about learning and what he likes, what he doesn't like, etc. And then I was able to identify that he did have dyslexia, but he also had autism as well. But what happened, because I'm not fully qualified to able to assess him properly, I did actually then ask him to be assessed by a professional, and I found someone for him to go to where they did identify him with those learning differences, and we were able to then support him better in class. He eventually did actually go on to get the score he needed for his IELTS and got into university to do the course he wanted to do as well. But it was because he was displaying these really difficult behaviours in class. Normally we would perhaps just kind of think, okay, I'm just going to leave you and you can just get on with it, you know, you're just being really difficult. But having that sort of conversation with the learner, trying to find out about them a little bit first and trying to understand what's going on in the background is really important. And in fact, I mean, with this learner, it turned out that he was having problems with sleep. He was quite depressed. He had very, very low self-confidence. And these were all things that were sort of side effects of what was happening to him as a dyslexic learner, and having sort of elements of autism there as well, because he was not able to sort of, he did not know what was going on and why he was the way he was, and why he couldn't sort of be part of the sort of class as everyone else was. And with adult learners, that you will find either they display behaviors like that, or they will be quite aggressive or just confrontational. I've had students who are quite confrontational and will display behaviors in other ways. And one of the sort of common side effects of having a learning difference is depression, because they haven't been able to sort of cope with a lot of these things. And building up their own strategies as well, you know, sort of throughout their lives, having to sort of hide things from people, which is quite common. So gathering background information is really important, finding out from the student, but also finding out from other people in the school as well. You can talk to, you know, the admin staff, you can talk to other teachers, find out how if they've taught this learner, sort of what kind of things they've picked up on. So it's gathering all that background information about the learner. That's really important. Talking about their sort of childhood, making sure that the student understands the implications of the assessments and findings is really important as well. So ensuring that, you know, while you're doing this, you make it clear to them why you're doing this, and the reasons behind it. And sometimes, as I said, some students don't want to be labelled in any way, and will not want to do the assessment and go ahead with sort of getting the right kind of support. But more often than not, if you handle it in a very sensitive way and to reassure the learner that is going to, in the long term, be something that's going to support them and help them, they're often quite willing to, you know, get that help as well. And often this doesn't just happen with language learners. So I do a lot of teacher training as well. So that, you know, when I'm training on the CELTAs, you get trainees who have gone through life not having been properly assessed or supported. And again, you know, sort of getting them to realize that about themselves is really you know, quite a revelation to them, actually. And you just see a very different person once you've sort of helped them understand that perhaps there is something else, and perhaps we need to be doing things in a different way. And it's almost like a weight lifting off their shoulders. And, you know, I had one CELTA trainee say to me, "I've always thought I was dumb. All throughout my life, I was made to feel like a dunce, you know, and suddenly now I understand." And then he then went on to say, "Well, actually, I think my daughter is also, you know, dyslexic," and had his daughter assessed eventually as well. And it, of course, she was on the spectrum of dyslexia as well. So, you know, understanding how we give feedback, how we communicate to the learner what we are trying to do with them is really, really important. There are lots of, in English language teaching, we are very good at doing, well, actually, I'll leave that for a second. We're going to have a look at the assessment tools and how we assess. So assessment tools. How do we assess our learners to find out if they do have a learning difference? Of course, there are lots of tools available that assess people. So here we're working with language learners, so that's quite a different way of assessing, I suppose. And which tools do we use? Now, I mean, as a teacher, things that we do in class and in ELT especially, we have lots and lots of resources at our hands that we can use to be able to sort of initially identify, to understand if our learners are having problems with learning. We do lots of memory games in class, for example, and those memory games can be used to actually see if a particular learner does have problems with short-term working memory, for example. You know, when, for example, sometimes like I will take in a tray of different items covered with a tea towel, and you show the tray to the learners, and they have a look at it, and then they have to remember all the items on the tray. You cover it back up again, or you take a couple of them away and then reveal the items again, and they have to identify which ones are missing, or you know, or you may just take the tray away and say, how many do you remember, what do you remember? So this is sort of memory games that we play with our learners quite a lot. It could be a way of assessing someone you may think has dyslexia or dyspraxia or ADHD, etc. So, you know, it's worth trying those kinds of games. Another thing that you could do with someone with dyslexia is phonological. Sort of, we have, again, you know, lots of games that we play with, you know, we have books on with activities that we do in class with phonology. So identifying different sounds of things. So one of the most common one is, for example, if you say to a student, sort of point to a chair and say, what's this? And they say it's a chair. And you ask them to remove the first two letters from there. So if you remove the ch, what are you left with? And they should really be able to say air. But if they're not able to, so for example, if they're not able to identify that, then there could be sort of, again, that issue with phonological processing. So using different sounds and removing sounds from words and asking them, so what word is that? How does that change the word? Can you hear the sound? Is it different? Using shapes as well. So we'll have a look at in our next session, because this is there's quite so much to do in these sessions, but activities that you can use in class to assess students' abilities as well. Areas of assessments, so students' backgrounds, their development of literacy practices, that's in L1, development of literacy practices, short-term and working memory, phonological processing, and speed of processing, so how quickly they're able to remember things as well. So there's also, you know, things like you've got the months of the year. Can they remember the months of the year backwards? So December, November, October, etc. Numbers, can we do it backwards? How quickly are they able to do that? How quickly are they able to remember certain things? So again, you know, words on paper, shapes, putting shapes back into some kind of order. So many different things that you can try in class to assess learners. What I can do is, because we are running out of time as well, I can send some additional materials for you after the sessions, and Sophie can send those out to everybody. So we don't want to hear things like this, you know, she doesn't get it. Why doesn't she get it? Everyone else does. He's just so difficult. I've tried everything. This student is just, you know, not learning at all. You know, why is this learner not a natural English learner or a natural language learner, whatever that is? These are things that I have heard in the staff room from other teachers. And, you know, when you're hearing things like this about one particular learner all the time, then that should be ringing bells for us. You know, that should be actually sort of highlighting that there's a problem with the learner. We need to be actually going in and finding out what's going on here. So thinking about, you know, what they're finding difficult, thinking about how they're behaving in class, thinking about the fact that are they having more problems with learning than the rest of the group? These are, you know, basic things that sometimes as busy teachers, we do forget. Because we've got so many things that we are doing in class and so many things to focus on, that particular student or those particular students often get sort of left and let them just get on. They're just being difficult. I'm not going to pay attention to that, or I'm sure it'll be fine. But yeah, so that's yes, I will send you. There's so many activities you can do. I'll send those along to Sophie, as I said, and then you can try those with your class, with your learners that you feel perhaps are having some issues. Now, I would say that the activities that I send you, you can actually do it as a whole class activity. You don't have to sort of single out that learner, because those activities are activities we would normally do with our students anyway. So you can do it as a whole class activity, but keep focus on the learner that you think you want to sort of identify if they have any learning difference. Because it's also not very nice if you kind of keep that learner behind and say to them, oh, okay, I want you to do this now. I'll focus on them in a different way. When I'm talking about inclusion, it's always about sort of, yes, we are very different, and it's about how it's not about sort of, treating people differently all the time. It's about how we include people in what we do every day. And in the UK, students often get taken out of class and sent off with the SEN person to do activities outside of class, which I think, yes, with sort of students on the extreme end of the spectrum, perhaps they need that kind of extra support. But those on sort of the sort of lower end of the spectrum, they need to be included in class in a much more inclusive way there. So we do have to pick out students who are learning in different ways, and think about how we can support them in our classes and be sort of more inclusive in how we are doing that as well, and not ignoring them, because ignoring them is the easiest option often, and we all do it. So here we've got sort of 5 clues to sort of recognising dyslexia. I'll leave that with you. We are running a little bit behind, as I said. These sessions can be a lot longer, and I've also included a couple of slides here for sort of online learning. And in the past year particularly, everyone has gone to switch to online learning, and that in itself has created a few problems as well, in that we're not face to face, and those learners who do have a learning difficulty, a learning difference, are more difficult to identify. And I've got some classes at the moment that I'm supporting, and it's quite easy to sort of see the learners who are perhaps who do have a learning difference, in that either their attendance is really poor, or they'll keep their camera switched off, or they just don't take part in the discussions as everyone else is doing. But yeah, it's a slightly more challenging environment that we're working with. But a couple of slides here. But often with students with learning differences, especially dyslexia, often are technology is actually a friend to them, and can help them quite a lot. And again, we'll talk about that in our next session. We just need to be able to understand if they are having those problems in the first place. So I've got, again, here you've got a slide in terms of online learning barriers to inclusion, and what the problems could be as well. I won't read through them. I'll allow you to have a look at this slide for yourself, and you can send questions through, Sophie, if you want to, and how to make it more accessible for your learners who are learning differently. Okay, and here again, we've got things that you can actually, let's go back a slide, because this is actually, we'll do this in the next session. Okay, so this is just something that you can have a look at for online learning as well. I'm going to actually, because we have run over time a little bit, I just wanted to give you some time to ask some questions as well, if you have any. Okay, so there is one question in the Q&A: which tools books are available for assessing the memory and phonological skills, the games that you mentioned? So actually quite a lot of what we already do, but as I mentioned earlier, I will send a list through to you after the session so that Sophie can pass it on to you. A lot of the books that we use in ELT, you can use quite a lot of those activities in those to do this, to assess learners. Okay, sorry about this. Any other questions before we? Yes, I'll make a note of that. So Sharon has asked if we can give a source of information about learning differences in Chinese students. We'll do that as well. You can use them for younger students and adult learners as well. It's just adapting them to younger learners. Obviously, some of the things that we use with adult learners we may not use with younger learners, but adapting some of the activities to younger learners can be done. Formal assessments are very difficult to get done, absolutely. It's not easy. I don't know some of the contexts that you perhaps are working in, but here in the UK, particularly with private language schools, we don't have any kind of support, any kind of support for learners with learning differences, because we're not taught how to identify these things. And so we often end up sending our learners to do it privately, and yes, it's very expensive to get a proper assessment done. Colleges and universities in the UK have systems set up, and they're able to assess in the organisation, and it's a much better system where you can actually refer the student. Online resources, yep. That's right. They are just basic good practice language tips anyway. I mean, you find a lot of this is sort of things that we as English language teachers do in the classroom quite a lot, and perhaps doesn't happen a lot in mainstream education. And so a lot of the assessment that we do can, we can sort of do it as a whole class activity. Is assessment covered by international health insurance in the UK? No, not as far as I know. So we've got how are many of those tools for younger? I don't know. Sorry, what do you think about humour in the classroom? Gamze, I didn't understand that. Using humour in the classroom, or someone who's breaking the ice, making it more inclusive. Are you talking about for learners with learning differences? So can you give me an example of that? Is it something that you've done with students? Okay. I've not heard about that one, using humour in the classroom. I mean, we use humour in sort of, in a light-hearted way with our classes, and breaking the ice with new students. Reading about how to use humour in the classroom. Okay. I'm not sure about that. No. So who's asking this question? Can I please clarify a point you made? Is it possible that a learning difference such as dyslexia may only present itself in L2? Okay. Sometimes, as I was giving you the okay, so it's, as I gave you the example of Italian students, with Italian students, dyslexia doesn't often display itself as quickly as it does in English, because it's a phonological, it's a phonetic language. They do get identified as having a learning difference, but it's usually much later. Whereas with others it could be a little bit earlier. Okay, I agree, Gamze, that humour can be a great icebreaker for all students. Yeah, Gamze, I think I can now, I see what you're trying to say here. However, and again, what we didn't talk about in this presentation was introverted students, and because that in itself can also be a class as a learning difficulty, and is it right to push those introverted students to be giving answers when they don't want to do that, or when it causes them anxiety, huge amount of anxiety, to be sort of focus of attention, etc. There's been a lot of discussion on that actually in how we deal with students who are introverted, because we in teaching, we always want to include everyone. We're always asking for answers or getting students engaged in one way or another, but sometimes they just don't want to be doing the things that we are asking them to do in the way we want them to do. So what works for them? How do we engage them? Humor can work, but it doesn't always work. It can end up making them feel more anxious as well. But it would be good to hear from you, Gamze, how you've used it, and any results that you've had with your learners, because it's always good to find out from people what they're doing in classrooms and what's helping them help their learners too. So that would be good. Maybe you can share that with us. Any more questions? Yeah, I think absolutely. As I said, it's I would like to see it and maybe hear more about it. So it would be good to get more information on that. Thank you for that, Gamze. I think that's it. I hope that helped a little bit. 45 minutes is far too short, Sophie.
Yeah, no, you did really well keeping it to an hour. So thank you. And yeah, thank you for a really fascinating and helpful presentation. And I think your personal examples from your teaching really brought the presentation to life as well. So yeah, they've definitely helped me to understand a lot of what you were saying. So thank you for sharing those examples as well.
You're welcome. I'm just glad I managed to get some information over to in that short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you were speaking, I realized what a huge topic it is as well.
Massive. Yes. I mean, this is something that normally we can kind of condense it down into a quick snapshot really here, but it takes 2 or 3, it's a full week's training sometimes, in terms of how we look at things. We break it all down, go into more detail about each of these things as well. Because a 1 hour session it goes by so quickly. We've only just touched on the topic really today, but at least it gets people thinking. And as I said, I will send you some materials. I'll follow this up with some materials that people can perhaps try in their classrooms
Yeah, wonderful. Yeah, because as you say, everyone's teaching in different contexts. So this was great to highlight the key areas and things to look out for. And yeah, and we can have a look at the resources as well. So thank you so much for this. And thanks to everyone for coming in, for all your really valuable contributions in the chat as well. I'm going to pop the URL for where you can register for the next session, which with Varinder on the 10th of March. And we hope to see you all there. Thanks again.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay.